In 2004, a team of officials stood in the rain-soaked courtyard of Apethorpe, clipboards in hand, documenting decades of decay. Water poured through gaping holes in the roof. Centuries-old plasterwork, once admired by King James himself, crumbled beneath their feet. The British government was about to do something it had only done once before in history: forcibly seize a palace. This was the moment when one of England's greatest royal residences stood on the precipice of total collapse, saved only by the rarest exercise of governmental power. Everything that King James I had built, every secret passage, every carved fireplace bearing his royal arms, every room where Elizabeth I had dined, was hours away from being lost forever. This is the story of Apethorpe Palace, a name so little known that even today most British citizens have never heard of it. Yet within its limestone walls, more monarchs slept, more royal intrigue unfolded, and more English history was made than at almost any other private house in the kingdom. For a brief, golden moment in the early 17th century, Apethorpe was the centre of English power, the place where a king came not out of duty but out of desire, where he met the man who would become his greatest love, where Shakespeare's contemporary Ben Jonson premiered court masques, where the fate of the Stuart dynasty was quietly being written in secret midnight meetings. And then, like so many dreams of grandeur, it faded. It faded so completely that by the end of the 20th century, this palace that had hosted 13 royal visits stood abandoned, its windows broken, its grounds overgrown, its future measured not in centuries but in months. To understand how this catastrophe occurred, we must travel back not just decades but half a millennium, to an England that was still finding its identity, still building the great houses that would define it, still creating the architectural language of power and prestige that we recognise today. We must meet the men who built Apethorpe, the monarchs who loved it, and the families who preserved it through civil war, revolution, and the slow erosion of aristocratic England. This is a story that spans 15 generations, from medieval manor to Tudor treasure, to Stuart showplace, to Georgian estate, to Victorian monument, to 20th century catastrophe, to 21st century resurrection. It is the biography not just of a building, but of England itself. The story of Apethorpe begins, as so many English estate stories do, in the mists of medieval land grants and forgotten nobles. The name Apethorpe appears in the Domesday Book of 1086, when the manor was held by a certain Countess Judith, niece of William the Conqueror. For the next 4 centuries the estate passed through various hands, noble families rising and falling with the tides of English politics. In May 1231, the young King Henry III granted the manor to Ralph le Breton, but within 13 months, on June 21st, 1232, the king changed his mind and took it back into royal hands. This early connection to the crown was prophetic. Apethorpe would spend much of its subsequent history orbiting the monarchy, sometimes owned by kings, sometimes visited by them, always somehow entangled in the affairs of state. By the 15th century, Apethorpe had come into the possession of Sir Guy Woolston, and it was he who built the first substantial house on the site. We know frustratingly little about this medieval structure. What we can say with certainty is that it followed the typical pattern of a late medieval manor house: a great hall open to the roof with service wings at one end and private chambers at the other, built around a courtyard for protection and to contain the noise and smell of livestock and servants. The walls were local limestone, that honey-coloured stone that characterises so much of Northamptonshire architecture, quarried from the beds that run like golden veins beneath the English Midlands. The roof would have been steep-pitched, covered in stone slates, designed to shed the English rain that falls with such monotonous regularity. Windows were small, glass was expensive, and comfort was a concept still centuries in the future. The house might have remained a minor manor, known only to local historians, had it not been for a transaction in 1515 that changed everything. In that year, a wealthy London merchant named Sir Henry Keble purchased Apethorpe. Keble was not nobility by birth, but he possessed something increasingly valuable in Tudor England: enormous amounts of money. He had made his fortune in the wool trade, that great engine of English prosperity, buying raw wool from English sheep farmers and selling finished cloth to merchants across Europe. By the time he bought Apethorpe, Keble was one of the richest men in England, wealthy enough to be noticed by the king himself. King Henry VIII, always in need of money to fund his wars, his building projects, and his increasingly complex personal life, had developed a habit of eyeing the estates of wealthy subjects. When Henry Keble died, his grandson, Lord Mountjoy, inherited Apethorpe, but not for long. Henry VIII convinced Mountjoy to sell him the estate, and Apethorpe became, for a brief time, royal property. This was not unusual. Henry VIII acquired dozens of properties during his reign, some through purchase, some through the dissolution of the monasteries, some through the convenient execution of their owners. What was unusual was what happened next. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his will carefully divided his properties among his children. Apethorpe, which Henry had never particularly favoured or visited, was left to his youngest child, his daughter Elizabeth. She was 14 years old at the time, a princess with an uncertain future, in a kingdom now ruled by her 9-year-old half-brother Edward VI. The gift of Apethorpe might have seemed minor at the time, a small country estate in an unfashionable part of England, but it represented something important, Henry V's recognition that even his daughters, even one born to a queen he had executed, deserved a place in England's landed elite. Elizabeth never lived at Apethorpe. As a princess, she had grander residences at her disposal, and when she became queen in 1558, she had all the royal palaces of England to choose from, but she did not forget Apethorpe. In April 1551, still a princess navigating the dangerous waters of her brother's court, she exchanged Apethorpe with Edward VI for properties in Gloucestershire and Berkshire. The new owner was Sir Walter Mildmay, and with his arrival the real story of Apethorpe begins. Sir Walter Mildmay was one of those remarkable Tudor figures who combined intellectual ability, administrative skill, political cunning, and genuine piety in proportions that allowed him not merely to survive, but to prosper through one of the most turbulent periods in English history. Born around 1520, he had risen through the royal bureaucracy, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer under Edward VI, surviving the bloody reign of Mary I by keeping his Protestant beliefs discreetly quiet, and then flourishing under Elizabeth I, who recognised in him a kindred spirit, pragmatic, cautious, intelligent, and utterly dedicated to the stability of the realm. When Mildmay acquired Apethorpe in 1551, he saw not just a house but an opportunity. He was rising in the world, accumulating wealth and influence, and he needed a seat that reflected his status. The medieval house that stood on the site was adequate but unimpressive. Mildmay set about transforming it into something worthy of a man who regularly sat at the council table with the Queen herself. The work Mildmay commissioned at Apethorpe between 1551 and his death in 1589 represents the first flowering of English Renaissance architecture, that moment when medieval forms began giving way to classical symmetry and Renaissance ornament. Mildmay did not demolish the medieval house entirely. Instead, following a pattern common in Tudor England, he encased it, expanded it, regularised it. He added a new range of buildings around the old courtyard, creating a quadrangular plan that would become typical of English great houses. He replaced the small medieval windows with larger ones, divided by stone mullions and transoms, flooding the interior with light. He built a new great hall, not medieval and open to the rafters, but Renaissance, and divided into 2 stories, with a magnificent ceiling of moulded plaster decorated with geometric patterns and heraldic devices. Most importantly, in 1562, Mildmay installed a stone chimney-piece in one of the principal rooms, engraved with his personal motto and the date. This fireplace survives today, and it is worth pausing to consider what it represents. In medieval England, fires burned in the centre of the great hall, and smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. The invention of the chimney, which seems obvious to us, was a revolution. It allowed for multiple floors, for smaller rooms, for privacy, for comfort. A grand fireplace, elaborately carved, became a statement of wealth and taste. Mildmay's 1562 fireplace, with its classical columns, its carved heraldry, its perfect proportions, announced to anyone who entered that room that the owner was a man of the new learning, a Renaissance courtier, not a medieval warlord. Mildmay's transformation of Apethorpe was not purely personal. He was building a stage set for the most important performance of Tudor England, the Royal Progress. Each summer, Queen Elizabeth I would leave London and travel through the countryside, staying at the houses of her nobles and wealthy subjects. These progresses served multiple purposes. They allowed the Queen to be seen by her subjects, reinforcing the personal nature of monarchy in an age before mass media. They saved money, since the cost of housing and feeding the enormous royal household fell on the host rather than the crown. They allowed Elizabeth to reward loyal subjects with the honour of a royal visit and to punish those who displeased her by staying away. And, not incidentally, they allowed the Queen to escape the summer heat and disease of London for the relative comfort and safety of the countryside. Hosting a royal progress was an expensive honour. The Queen travelled with an entourage of hundreds: courtiers, servants, guards, secretaries, the entire machinery of government. They required lodging, feeding, entertaining. Rooms had to be specially prepared, furniture brought in, provisions laid in by the ton. Entertainment had to be arranged: music, dancing, hunting, sometimes elaborate theatrical performances. The cost could be ruinous. Some nobles bankrupted themselves trying to impress the Queen. Others avoided the honour entirely, pleading poverty or claiming their houses were undergoing repairs. Walter Mildmay was too intelligent to avoid the Queen's visits and too successful to claim poverty. Between 1562 and 1587, Elizabeth visited Apethorpe 3 times. In 1562, early in her reign when Mildmay's renovations were just beginning. In 1566, when the house was complete, and finally in 1587, when both Queen and courtier were growing old. These visits established Apethorpe's reputation as a suitable royal residence. The Queen approved of the house, found it comfortable, enjoyed Mildmay's hospitality. More importantly, she talked about it, and in the hermetic world of the Elizabethan court, where advancement depended on royal favour, and royal favour depended on being noticed, having a house the Queen praised was a valuable asset. Walter Mildmay died in 1589, one of the few men who managed to serve Elizabeth for 3 decades, without falling from favour or losing his head. He left Apethorpe to his eldest son, Sir Anthony Mildmay, who had been born around 1549 and had grown up in the house his father was building. Anthony Mildmay was a less impressive figure than his father. He served as a Member of Parliament and held local offices, but he never achieved his father's national prominence. He was, however, a careful steward of the Apethorpe estate, maintaining his father's buildings and continuing to welcome royal visitors. When Anthony Mildmay died in 1617, Apethorpe passed not to a son but to a daughter. Mary Mildmay had been born in 1581 or 1582, and in 1617, the same year she inherited Apethorpe, she married Sir Francis Fane, a member of an old Yorkshire noble family. This marriage would prove to be the most important event in Apethorpe's history, because Francis Fane was not just any nobleman. In 1624 he was created Earl of Westmoreland, one of the oldest and most prestigious titles in the English peerage. More importantly, the Fanes were closely connected to the new king, James I, who had ascended the English throne in 1603 after the death of Elizabeth. James I changed everything for Apethorpe. Where Elizabeth had visited 3 times in 45 years, James visited at least 13 times in the first 33 years of his reign. These were not brief overnight stays, but extended visits, sometimes lasting weeks, with the king bringing his entire court. James I loved Apethorpe in a way Elizabeth never had. He called it one of his favourite residences. He hunted in its parks, walked in its gardens, held court in its halls. Most extraordinarily, in 1622 he personally financed a major expansion of the house, adding a new suite of staterooms specifically designed for royal use. To understand why James loved Apethorpe so much, we need to understand the man himself. James was 42 years old when he visited Apethorpe for the first time in 1605, already King of Scotland for 38 years and now newly King of England as well. He was highly intelligent, educated in multiple languages, author of several books on subjects ranging from witchcraft to the divine right of kings. He was also deeply eccentric, with a pronounced Scottish accent that his English courtiers mocked, a terror of assassination that bordered on paranoia, and physical habits that shocked the refined English court. He picked his nose in public, drank too much, rarely bathed, and had a tongue so large for his mouth that he drooled when he spoke. But James's greatest eccentricity, the one that would shape Apethorpe's history, was his sexuality. James I was openly, flagrantly homosexual, or perhaps more accurately bisexual, at a time when homosexuality was not merely illegal, but a capital crime. He had married Anne of Denmark for political reasons, and fathered several children with her, but his real affections were directed at a series of handsome young men whom he elevated to positions of wealth and power. The English court, accustomed to the celibate Elizabeth, was scandalized. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing the king's beastly behaviour with his favourites. Preachers condemned him from the pulpit, but James, secure in his belief in the divine right of kings, ignored them all. James's most famous favourite was George Villiers, who rose from obscurity to become Duke of Buckingham, the most powerful man in England after the king himself. And it was at Apethorpe, in August 1614, that James III first met George Villiers. The circumstances of their meeting have the quality of romantic legend. James was at Apethorpe for one of his extended hunting visits. Villiers, then just 22 years old, was brought to the house by a faction of courtiers who hoped to use his beauty to distract the king from his current favourite. The plan worked beyond anyone's expectations. James was instantly besotted. Within a year, Villiers had been knighted. Within 3 years, he was a viscount. Within 5 years, he was the most powerful man in the kingdom. The relationship between James and Villiers was physical. We know this not from rumour but from their own letters, which survive in remarkable detail. James called Villiers his sweet child and wife, signed his letters your dear dad and husband, and wrote in terms that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. I naturally so love your person and adore all your other parts, which are more than infinitely dear to me, James wrote in one letter. In another, I desire only to live in the world for your sake. What does this have to do with Apethorpe? Everything. When James decided in 1622 to expand the house, he was creating a private world for himself and his favourite. The expansion James financed was not a random architectural exercise, but a carefully planned suite of royal apartments, connected by private passages, designed for intimacy and privacy. This brings us to one of the most extraordinary discoveries made during the 21st century restoration of Apethorpe, the secret passage connecting the king's bedchamber to the apartments of the Duke of Buckingham. The discovery was made by workers in the early 2000s, during the comprehensive restoration of the house. Behind a wall panel in the king's bedchamber, they found a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for a man to walk through, leading directly to another set of rooms. The passage was dated through architectural analysis to between 1622 and 1624, exactly the period when James financed the expansion. There is no practical reason for this passage to exist. The two sets of rooms are in the same wing of the house, easily accessible by the main corridors. The only logical explanation is that James wanted to be able to visit Villiers' apartments in complete privacy, without being seen by servants or courtiers. This secret passage is not just an architectural curiosity. It is physical evidence of one of the great love stories of English history, a romance between a king and a commoner that scandalized a nation and changed the course of history. And it is uniquely associated with Apethorpe. James had many palaces, many grand houses where he stayed with Villiers, but only at Apethorpe did he care enough to finance a secret passage for their meetings. The 1622 expansion that James financed transformed Apethorpe from a large country house into something that deserved to be called a palace. The work was extensive and expensive. James rebuilt the entire south range of the house, adding a full story and creating a complete suite of staterooms on the first floor. These rooms consisted of the dining chamber, where the king would take his meals in public, the drawing chamber, where he would receive courtiers and conduct informal business, the king's bedchamber, the most private and sacred space in the palace, the Prince of Wales' bedchamber, for the heir to the throne, and the long gallery, a space for exercise and display that stretched the entire length of the South Range. Each of these rooms was decorated with elaborate plasterwork ceilings and carved stone fireplaces of extraordinary quality. The plasterwork was executed by master craftsmen, probably brought from London or even from Europe, working in the latest Jacobean style. The ceilings featured geometric patterns, heraldic devices, and symbolic imagery. In the king's bedchamber, the ceiling was decorated with the royal arms of England, surrounded by emblems of royal power, crowns, sceptres, orbs. The message was clear. This was not just a room, but a throne room in miniature, a space where the sacred person of the king resided. The fireplaces were even more elaborate. Each one was carved from local limestone, standing 8 to 10 feet tall with classical columns, intricate heraldry, and iconographical programs that would have been understood by educated Jacobeans as statements about kingship. In the king's bedchamber, the fireplace was decorated with a hunting scene. This might seem merely decorative, but hunting imagery in Jacobean England was loaded with meaning. The king as hunter was a common metaphor for the king as ruler, powerful, skilled, dominating nature and lesser creatures. Above the hunting scene, the royal arms proclaimed James's sovereignty, and at the very top of the fireplace, barely visible from ground level, was carved the date 1622. The Prince of Wales' bedchamber had its own distinctive fireplace, carved with the 3 feathers that were the emblem of the heir to the throne. This room was intended for Prince Charles, James's surviving son, who would become King Charles I in 1625. Charles visited Apethorpe many times during his father's reign, and would continue to visit as king, making Apethorpe one of the very few English houses to be regularly used by both James I and Charles III. The Long Gallery was perhaps the most impressive space James created at Apethorpe. Long galleries were a distinctive feature of Elizabethan and Jacobean houses, serving as indoor exercise spaces during England's frequent bad weather and as display rooms for portraits and tapestries. Apethorpe's Long Gallery ran the entire length of the South Range, probably close to 150 feet, with windows along both long sides flooding the space with light. The ceiling was decorated with elaborate geometric plasterwork. At one end stood a monumental fireplace, and above it was carved a remarkable verse composed by Mary, Countess of Westmoreland, the daughter of Anthony Mildmay, who had inherited Apethorpe and married into the Fane family. Rare and ever to be wished may sound here, instruments which faint spirits and muses cheer, composing for the body, soul, and ear, which sickness, sadness, and foul spirits fear. This verse is a small masterpiece of Jacobean thought. It expresses the Renaissance belief that music could heal body and soul, that harmony and sound reflected divine harmony, that art could drive away melancholy and evil. Mary Westmoreland was not a professional poet, but she was clearly educated and familiar with the ideas of her age. Her verse, carved in stone above the fireplace in the Long Gallery, remains there today, one of the few surviving examples of a woman's voice literally inscribed into the fabric of an English country house. James also built or rebuilt the external entrance to the staterooms, creating a grand portal surmounted by a statue of himself. This statue survives, though weathered by 4 centuries of English weather. It shows James in royal robes, sceptre in hand, looking down at those who enter. The symbolism was deliberate. Anyone approaching the staterooms had to pass beneath the king's gaze, a reminder that they were entering royal space, that they came only by royal permission. The architectural style of James's additions to Apethorpe is distinctively Jacobean, that transitional moment between the last flowering of the English Renaissance and the first hints of classical Baroque. The architect is not definitively known, but scholarship points to Thomas Thorpe, brother of the more famous John Thorpe. Thomas Thorpe was not a gentleman architect, but a professional, one of a new class of designers who worked for multiple clients and brought a more systematic, professional approach to architecture. His work at Apethorpe shows both learning and practicality. The classical orders are correctly deployed, the proportions are harmonious, but the overall effect is still distinctively English rather than continental. The roofline is steep, the windows are large and mullioned, The exterior is relatively plain limestone rather than the elaborate stucco and sculpture of Italian Baroque. The scale of James's work at Apethorpe was enormous. Contemporary records, though fragmentary, suggest that the king spent at least £6 million in period money on the expansion. To put this in perspective, £6 million in 1622 had the purchasing power of approximately £200 million, or nearly $300 million in modern terms. This was not a renovation. It was the construction of what amounted to a new palace, incorporated into and expanding the existing house. Why did James spend so much? Partly because he could. James had access to the revenues of the entire kingdom, partly because he wanted to impress. A king's grandeur was measured by the magnificence of his buildings, but mostly, I think, because he loved this place. Apethorpe was one of his favourite residences, he said so repeatedly, and he wanted it to be perfect. He wanted state rooms worthy of a king, galleries for art and music, fireplaces that proclaimed his majesty. And, though he never said this in any surviving document, he wanted spaces where he could be with the man he loved, away from the prying eyes of courtiers who disapproved and the ambassadors who wrote home about his scandalous behaviour. The scale of the house James created can be measured in simple numbers. When the 1622 expansion was complete, Apethorpe had grown to approximately 51,000 square feet of floor space, spread over multiple levels and wings. To give a sense of what this means, the average English country house of the period had perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 square feet. Hampton Court Palace, one of Henry VIII's great palaces, had about 200,000 square feet, but Hampton Court was a true palace, maintained by the Crown with dozens of buildings. Apethorpe was technically a private house owned by the Fane family, yet it had more space than many royal residences. It was vast. The house James created was organised around 3 courtyards, a plan that gave Apethorpe, as Country Life magazine later observed, something of the character of a Cambridge college. The first courtyard, the largest, was the original medieval and Tudor courtyard, now surrounded by ranges of rooms and buildings, added over a century and a half. The second courtyard was created by James's expansion, a more intimate space accessed through the staterooms. The third courtyard was service spaces, kitchens, laundries, stables, all the infrastructure necessary to run what was essentially a small palace. The 3-courtyard plan had practical advantages. It allowed for a clear separation between public and private spaces, between the ceremonial and the domestic, between family and servants. A visitor to Apethorpe would enter through the main gate into the first courtyard, be received in the Great Hall, and then, if sufficiently important, be conducted through the connecting passages to the state rooms in the second courtyard. The king's bedchamber was the innermost sanctum, accessible only to those of the highest rank or special favour. Servants used separate stairs and corridors, moving through the house like ghosts, visible only when needed, otherwise invisible. This choreography of space was essential to the functioning of a great house, and Apethorpe's 3 courtyards allowed it to operate smoothly, even when housing hundreds of people during a royal visit. Beyond the building itself, James also invested in the grounds. He expanded the deer park, essential for the royal hunts he loved. He laid out formal gardens in the latest style with geometric beds, gravel walks and fountains. He planted specimen trees, including in 1614 a Lebanese cedar that still stands today, certified as the oldest surviving Lebanese cedar in England. This tree is now a scheduled monument in its own right, protected by law, a living link to James I. Imagine, 400 years ago, James I or someone in his household planted a seed or a sapling, and it grew and grew and grew, surviving civil war and revolution and world wars, until it became a giant, its massive horizontal branches spreading wide, its dark green needles unchanging through the seasons. When you stand beneath this tree today, you are standing beneath the same branches that might have shaded King James I. The Golden Age of Apethorpe, the period when it functioned as a true royal residence, lasted from 1605, when James first visited, to 1636, when Charles I made his last visit. During those 31 years, Apethorpe hosted at least 13 extended royal visits. 13. To put this in context, this was more royal visits than any other house in Northamptonshire, more than most houses anywhere in England. Only a handful of the greatest royal palaces and the houses of the highest nobility saw as many royal visits as Apethorpe. What happened during these visits? Life at Apethorpe during a royal progress was transformed. The normal rhythm of a country house, the quiet routine of family life punctuated by meals and prayers and seasonal agricultural tasks, was completely overwhelmed. Weeks before the king arrived, preparations began. The staterooms had to be cleaned, aired, furnished. Special furniture, tapestries and bedding were brought from London, along with the king's personal servants who knew his preferences and habits. Provisions were ordered by the ton: meat, fish, game, bread, beer, wine. The royal household consumed food on a scale almost impossible to imagine. A single day's meals for the king and his court could require dozens of sheep, several cattle, hundreds of chickens, barrels of oysters, hundreds of gallons of wine and beer, countless loaves of bread. The Fane family as hosts bore the cost of all this. They provided not just food and lodging but entertainment. Musicians were hired, actors brought from London, hunting parties organised. The king expected to be amused, diverted, impressed. James I was particularly fond of masks, those elaborate theatrical performances combining music, dance, poetry, and spectacular scenery that were the signature art form of the Jacobean court. At Apethorpe, several masks written by Ben Jonson, one of England's greatest playwrights and poets, were performed for James. These masks are lost now, their texts perhaps destroyed, performed once or twice and then forgotten. But imagine what it must have been like. The long gallery transformed into a theatre, musicians playing, dancers in elaborate costumes performing allegorical stories about nymphs and shepherds and classical gods, all designed to flatter the king and celebrate his wisdom and power. The household staff during a royal visit swelled from perhaps 30 or 40 permanent servants to several hundred temporary ones. The Fanes employed a full hierarchy of servants: a steward who managed the entire household, a chamberlain who oversaw the indoor staff, a comptroller who handled finances, gentlemen ushers who managed access to the family, a chaplain who conducted daily prayers, secretaries who handled correspondence. Below them were the working servants: cooks, scullery maids, laundresses, chambermaids, footmen, stable hands, gardeners, gamekeepers. During a royal visit, this staff had to be augmented massively. Extra cooks were hired to prepare the elaborate meals. Extra grooms were needed to care for the horses of the royal party. Extra servants of all kinds were recruited from the surrounding villages, paid a few pence a day to help with the overwhelming work. The logistics were staggering. The king travelled with his own cooks, but they worked in the host's kitchens, which had to be large enough and well equipped enough to handle the increased load. Apethorpe's kitchens, located in the north range of the house, were extensive: multiple fireplaces for roasting meat, brick ovens for baking bread, work tables for preparing food, storage rooms for provisions. But even these facilities were stretched during a royal visit. Food had to be cooked and served continuously from early morning until late at night. The king dined formally at midday and in the evening, but courtiers were eating at all hours, and servants needed to be fed as well. Water was another challenge. A house the size of Apethorpe during a royal visit could use hundreds of gallons of water per day, for cooking, washing, drinking. In the early 17th century, this water had to be drawn from wells or collected from streams and carried by hand. Apethorpe was fortunate to be located near several springs and small streams, ensuring a reliable water supply, but it still required constant labour to keep the house supplied. Sanitation was primitive. The house had a few indoor privies, essentially stone seats over chutes that dropped waste into cesspits below, but most people used chamber pots, which servants emptied into the cesspits or into designated areas of the grounds. During a royal visit, with hundreds of people in residence, the smell must have been overwhelming. This is one reason why great houses like Apethorpe were built with so many windows, not for the view, though that was a bonus, but for ventilation. Despite all the discomfort and expense, hosting the king was considered an honour. It demonstrated loyalty, it brought prestige, and it could lead to tangible rewards. James I was generous to those who pleased him, granting titles, offices, pensions. Sir Francis Fane was created Earl of Westmoreland in 1624, partly in recognition of his family's hospitality to the king at Apethorpe. For a family on the margins of the highest nobility, such a title was transformative. It meant a seat in the House of Lords, precedence at court, a permanent place in the upper reaches of English society. The royal visitors to Apethorpe were not just the king. James's queen, Anne of Denmark, visited at least once in August 1605. Anne and James had a complicated relationship. They had married for political reasons, she a Danish princess, he a Scottish king, their union designed to strengthen ties between Scotland and Denmark. They had produced several children, but they did not get along. Anne was Catholic or Catholic sympathising in an increasingly Protestant England. She was extravagant, spending enormous sums on jewellery, clothes and court entertainments. She resented James's male favourites, particularly George Villiers, who eventually displaced her entirely from the king's affections. By 1605, when she visited Apethorpe, the marriage was already fraying. Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, visited Apethorpe multiple times. As a young man, he hunted with his father in Apethorpe's deer park. As king, after his father's death in 1625, he continued the tradition of royal visits. Charles I was a very different man from his father. Where James was extroverted, jovial, gregarious, Charles was reserved, formal, obsessed with court ceremony and royal dignity. Where James had been tolerant in religion, willing to compromise, Charles was rigid, determined to impose his vision of Anglicanism on all his subjects. These differences would lead Charles into a catastrophic conflict with Parliament, civil war, and eventually in 1649, execution, the only English king ever to be judicially murdered by his own subjects. But in the 1620s and early 1630s, when Charles visited Apethorpe, these disasters still lay in the future. Charles used Apethorpe much as his father had, as a hunting lodge and a retreat from London. His last visit was in 1636, just 3 years before the outbreak of civil war. After 1636, the age of royal visits to Apethorpe ended. Charles was too preoccupied with the growing political crisis to go on progresses. Then came the Civil War, which tore England apart for 9 years. Then came Charles's execution, and the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, the world had changed. The new king had no memory of Apethorpe, no connection to the house. The age of the royal progress was over. The court became more centralised in London. Kings stopped travelling the country, staying at the houses of their subjects. Apethorpe's role as a royal palace ended as suddenly as it had begun. But the house survived. The Fane family, Earls of Westmoreland, continued to live there for nearly 3 more centuries. They were not the richest or most powerful noble family in England, but they were solid, respectable, landed. Apethorpe remained their principal seat, the centre of their estates, the symbol of their family continuity. Over the generations, successive earls made changes to the house, adapting it to changing tastes and needs. The most significant alteration came in the 18th century, during the Georgian period, when classical architecture became fashionable in England. The architect Roger Morris was commissioned to redesign parts of Apethorpe in the Neo-Palladian style that restrained symmetrical classical architecture inspired by the Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. Morris's work at Apethorpe was never fully completed, but what was done changed the character of parts of the house. Some of the Jacobean windows were replaced with Georgian sash windows. Some interiors were redecorated in the Neo-Palladian style, with elegant plasterwork, classical mouldings, and fashionable colour schemes of white, pale blue and green. Morris also designed or redesigned the orangery, a building for growing citrus trees, which had become fashionable among the English aristocracy in the 18th century. An orangery was both a practical building, protecting expensive exotic plants from the English cold, and a status symbol, demonstrating that the owner had the wealth and taste to cultivate Mediterranean plants in northern Europe. Apethorpe's orangery was incorporated into the house itself, becoming part of the Elizabethan range, a testament to how the house was constantly being adapted and reimagined. In the 19th century, Another wave of alterations came, this time in the neo-Jacobean style. Victorian England was fascinated by its own past, and there was a fashion for restoring or recreating Tudor and Jacobean architecture. The architect, Sir Reginald Blomfield, one of the most distinguished architects of his generation, was commissioned to work at Apethorpe. Blomfield was known for his scholarly approach to historic architecture. He studied original Jacobean buildings carefully, understanding their proportions, their ornament, their materials. His work at Apethorpe was sympathetic to the existing Jacobean structure. He did not try to impose a new vision, but rather to complete and enhance what was already there. He designed new formal gardens, laid out in geometric patterns that referenced Renaissance and Baroque garden design. He made alterations to the interior, adding or restoring decorative plasterwork and woodwork in the Jacobean style. The result of all these centuries of alteration was a house of extraordinary complexity. Apethorpe in the early 20th century contained architectural elements from 5 centuries, medieval stonework in the foundations and core structure, Tudor work from the Mildmays, Jacobean staterooms from James II, Georgian interiors from Roger Morris, and Victorian neo-Jacobean additions from Blomfield. It was a palimpsest, each generation writing its own story over the previous ones, yet never entirely erasing what came before. Throughout all these centuries, through all these architectural changes, Apethorpe remained the seat of the Earls of Westmoreland. The Fane family lived there continuously from 1617, when Mary Mildmay married Sir Francis Fane, until 1904, nearly 300 years. Think about what that means. 10, 11, 12 generations of the same family, born in this house, growing up in these rooms, hunting in these parks, buried in the local church. The house was not just a building, but the physical embodiment of the family, a continuity of stone and mortar spanning centuries. But by the end of the 19th century, the world was changing in ways that would eventually prove fatal to houses like Apethorpe. The Industrial Revolution had created new forms of wealth that dwarfed the old agricultural wealth of the landed aristocracy. Income tax, introduced in Britain in 1799 as a temporary measure to fund the Napoleonic Wars, had become permanent and was rising. Death duties, introduced in 1894, taxed inherited estates, making it increasingly difficult for landed families to pass their property intact from generation to generation. The agricultural depression of the late 19th century reduced rental income from farms. Servants were becoming harder to find and more expensive, as young people left rural areas for cities and factories where wages were higher and hours shorter. The 12th Earl of Westmoreland and his son, who succeeded as the 13th Earl, faced these challenges and struggled to meet them. Apethorpe was expensive to maintain. The house required constant repairs. The roof, which covered an area of several thousand square feet, needed to be reslated regularly. The windows, hundreds of them, needed repairing. The plasterwork cracked and needed restoration. The heating system, such as it was, required constant attention. The grounds needed dozens of gardeners and groundskeepers. The total cost of maintaining Apethorpe in full Victorian splendour was ruinous. In 1904, faced with debts and declining income, the 13th Earl of Westmoreland made the painful decision to sell Apethorpe. It was the end of an era. Nearly 3 centuries of Fane family ownership ended. The house was purchased by Henry Brassey, a member of a family that had made an enormous fortune in railroad construction. The Brasseys were not old nobility but new money, and they had the resources to maintain Apethorpe that the Westmorelands no longer possessed. The Brasseys lived at Apethorpe through the first half of the 20th century, a period that saw 2 world wars, the decline of the British Empire, and the transformation of British society. After World War II, the Brasseys, like so many landed families, found themselves in financial difficulty. The house was too large, too expensive, no longer suited to mid-20th century life. Servants had become almost impossible to find. Heating a house of 50,000 square feet during the coal shortages of the post-war years was a nightmare. The Brassey family moved out of the main house and into a smaller manor house on the estate, a pattern repeated across England as great houses became unmanageable. The Brasseys sold much of the Apethorpe estate, breaking up the agricultural lands that had supported the house for centuries. But they kept the house itself, looking for a way to preserve it. In the 1950s, they found what seemed like an ideal solution. They leased Apethorpe to the Catholic Church, which converted it into an approved school, a kind of boarding school for boys who had behavioural problems or came from troubled backgrounds. This was not an unusual fate for a great house in the mid-20th century. Many were converted to schools, hospitals, hotels, or institutional use, anything to cover the costs of maintenance and preservation. For nearly 3 decades, from the 1950s to 1982, Apethorpe was a school. Boys lived in dormitories in what had been the state rooms. They studied in classrooms created by subdividing the great halls. They played football in the deer park where King James I had hunted. The long gallery, where Ben Jonson's masques had been performed, became a corridor. The king's bedchamber, where James I had slept and where a secret passage led to his favourites' rooms, was divided into offices. The school covered the extraordinary carved fireplaces with boards to protect them. The plasterwork ceilings were painted over with institutional cream and green, but the school preserved the house, after a fashion. The roof was maintained, the windows were repaired when they broke, the structure remained sound, and then, in 1982, the school closed. Demographic changes, financial pressures, changing attitudes toward institutional care of children all combined to make the school unviable. The Catholic Church gave up the lease. The Brasseys, by now represented by descendants with no direct connection to Apethorpe, decided to sell. In 1983, Apethorpe was sold to Wanis Mohammed Bouwaila, a Libyan businessman. Bouwaila had an ambitious plan. He would convert Apethorpe into a university, creating an international institution in the courtyards and cloisters of this historic palace. It was an interesting idea, not unlike the use of many Oxford and Cambridge colleges, which were, after all, built around courtyards much like Apethorpe's. Bouwaila began some preliminary work, drawing up plans, consulting with architects and educators, but the plan never materialised. Bouwaila's financial situation became complicated. Political changes in Libya made his position uncertain. By the late 1980s, he had left Britain, returning to Libya, and Apethorpe was left empty, abandoned, locked up but not maintained. And this is when the real catastrophe began. An empty house deteriorates faster than an occupied one. Water is the enemy. Once the roof starts to leak, water enters the building, and once water is inside, destruction accelerates. Plasterwork that has survived for 4 centuries can be destroyed in a few years of exposure to rain. Wooden beams rot, stone cracks as water freezes and expands in winter. Apethorpe, abandoned and unmaintained, began to collapse. By the mid-1990s, the situation was desperate. Local historians and preservationists raised the alarm. Apethorpe, one of England's most important historic houses, was dying. The roof was failing. Water was pouring into the staterooms. The extraordinary Jacobean plasterwork was falling from the ceilings. The carved fireplaces, some of the finest surviving examples of Jacobean craftsmanship in England, were at risk. Photographs from this period are heartbreaking. They show rooms filled with rubble, plaster lying in heaps on the floor, windows broken, vegetation growing inside the house. In 1998, when English Heritage established its Buildings at Risk Register, a database of historic buildings in danger of being lost, Apethorpe was included on it. More than that, it was classified as one of the most important buildings at risk in the entire country. The register categorised buildings by their level of risk and their significance. Apethorpe was given the highest significance rating and the highest risk rating. It was a Grade Y listed building, meaning it was of exceptional national importance, and it was in very bad condition, at immediate risk of total loss. English Heritage, the government agency responsible for protecting historic buildings, began exploring options. Could Bouwaila be persuaded to sell? Could a buyer be found who would restore the house? Could any organisation take it on? The problem was the scale of the required work. Preliminary estimates suggested that full restoration would cost at least £15 to £20 million, possibly more. And even after restoration, the house would need constant maintenance, costing hundreds of thousands of pounds per year. What individual, what organisation could take on such a burden? Years passed. The house continued to deteriorate. English Heritage tried to negotiate with Buckingham, but he was unresponsive. He would not sell, but he would not maintain the property. From his perspective, perhaps, Apethorpe was an asset, something he would eventually return to or sell for a profit. But from the perspective of preservationists, every year of delay meant more destruction, more loss. Finally, in 2004, the British government took an extraordinary step. Under Section 47 of the Planning, Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas, Act 1990, the government has the power to compulsorily purchase a listed building if it is at risk and the owner is unwilling or unable to preserve it. This power had been used only once before in British history. Using it is controversial, a direct violation of property rights, a stark intervention of the state into private ownership. But the government decided that Apethorpe was too important to lose. In September 2004, the entire remaining Apethorpe estate was compulsorily purchased by the British government. Buckingham was compensated, though the amount was not made public. English Heritage took possession of the house and immediately began emergency stabilisation work. The first priority was the roof. Until the roof was repaired, nothing else could be done. Water had to be kept out. English Heritage brought in specialist roofing contractors, and over the next 2 years the entire roof of Apethorpe was reslated, retimbered where necessary, made waterproof. The cost of this work alone was approximately £8 million. With the roof secure, English Heritage could assess the full extent of the damage inside the house. It was worse than feared. Much of the Jacobean plasterwork had been destroyed. Ceilings had collapsed. The wooden floors, 4 centuries old, were rotted and unsafe. The historic fireplaces, mercifully, had mostly survived, though they were dirty and damaged. The long gallery, once the glory of the house, was a ruin, its floor unsafe, its windows broken, its walls stained with damp. English Heritage brought in specialists, architectural historians to document what survived, conservators to stabilise delicate plasterwork and woodwork, structural engineers to assess the soundness of the building. The work was painstaking. Every room was photographed, measured, analysed. Fragments of plasterwork were carefully collected and catalogued in the hope that they could eventually be reassembled or used as models for restoration. But English Heritage faced a fundamental problem. It was a preservation agency, not a wealthy landowner. It could stabilise Apethorpe, make it weatherproof, prevent further deterioration. It could not afford to fully restore the house and maintain it indefinitely. The estimated cost of full restoration was climbing, now estimated at £25 to £30 million, and after restoration, annual maintenance costs would be substantial, perhaps £1 million per year. English Heritage simply did not have this kind of money. The only solution was to find a private buyer, someone who would purchase Apethorpe, complete its restoration, and commit to maintaining it. But what kind of person would take on such a project? It would require someone with substantial wealth, a love of historic buildings, and a willingness to dedicate years of their life to a massive restoration project. English Heritage launched a search for a buyer in 2007. The asking price was initially set at around £6 million, which seems remarkably low for a historic palace, but of course the buyer would need to spend many times that amount on restoration. And there were strings attached. English Heritage required that any buyer commit to completing the restoration, to maintaining the house to the highest standards, and to opening it to the public for at least some days each year. These requirements were necessary to ensure that public money spent on stabilisation would benefit the public, but they also made the property less attractive to potential buyers. Years passed. Potential buyers came to look at Apethorpe, walked through its ruined rooms, calculated the costs, and walked away. The house was too big, too expensive, too damaged. In 2008, English Heritage reduced the asking price to £4.5 million, still with no buyer. The property was starting to seem unsaleable. Then, in 2014, a buyer emerged. Baron Jean-Christophe Isseux von Fetten, a French aristocrat and businessman with a love of English architecture and field sports, had been looking for a historic property in England. He had experience restoring historic buildings in France. He understood what he was taking on, and crucially, he had the resources to see the project through. Negotiations were complex. Baron von Fetten was willing to buy Apethorpe and commit to its restoration, but he wanted to live there as his private residence. He was willing to open the house to the public, but not to turn it into a museum. He wanted to make Apethorpe a home again, not a monument. English Heritage and Baron von Fetten negotiated an agreement that balanced these interests. Baron von Fetten would purchase the house for an undisclosed sum, believed to be between £3 and £4 million. He would commit to completing the restoration, estimated to cost at least £20 million of his own money, and he would open the house to the public for 50 days per year for 80 years, far longer than the normal 10-year requirement for grant-aided properties. In December 2014, the sale was announced. Simon Thurley, English Heritage's chief executive, said, "Since 2000, English Heritage has consistently said that the best solution for Apethorpe is for it to be taken on by a single owner who wants to continue to restore the house and to live in it, especially one who has experience of restoring historic buildings and is prepared to share its joys with a wide public, as Baron Fetten will do. Apethorpe is certainly on a par with Hatfield and Knowle, and is by far the most important country house to have been threatened with major loss through decay since the 1950s. As part of the sale, English Heritage and Baron von Fetten agreed to rename the house Apethorpe Palace, acknowledging its royal history and its architectural significance. The decision was somewhat controversial. In England, the title palace is normally reserved for royal residences or for the very grandest episcopal residences, but English Heritage argued that Apethorpe deserved the title. It had been extensively used by monarchs. It had been partially built and financed by a king. Its staterooms were palace quality. The change was made official in April 2015 when the National Heritage List was updated to register the property as Apethorpe Palace. Since 2015, Baron von Fetten has been engaged in the massive project of restoring Apethorpe. The work is ongoing as of this writing and will likely continue for many more years. Restoration of a building like Apethorpe is not simply a matter of repairing damage. It requires painstaking research to understand what the building looked like at different periods of its history, skilled craftsmen to recreate lost or damaged elements using traditional techniques and materials, and constant decision-making about what to restore, what to preserve as it is, what to reconstruct. Some elements of the restoration are straightforward, if expensive. Replacing rotten floorboards with new oak, cut and finished in the traditional manner. Repairing or replacing broken windows. Cleaning stonework. Installing modern services like plumbing, electricity and heating in ways that do not damage historic fabric. Other elements are far more complex. The Jacobean plasterwork ceilings, some of which survived only in fragments, require specialist conservators who understand 17th century techniques. Each surviving piece of plasterwork is carefully cleaned, stabilized, and reattached. Where plasterwork is lost entirely, the decision must be made whether to recreate it. If the decision is to recreate, the conservators must research what the original looked like, studying surviving fragments, comparing with similar work in other buildings, examining historic photographs if they exist, and then modelling and casting new plasterwork using traditional materials and techniques. The fireplaces, though structurally sound, require careful conservation. 4 centuries of coal and wood fires have left them covered in soot and grime. Cleaning reveals the extraordinary quality of the carving, but it must be done carefully to avoid damaging the stone. Broken elements must be repaired or, in some cases, replaced with new carving. The gardens and grounds require restoration as well. Blomfield's formal gardens had been abandoned for decades and were completely overgrown. Archaeological investigation, using ground-penetrating radar and excavation, revealed the outlines of the original garden design. These are now being restored, with hedges replanted, paths relaid, parterres recreated. Baron von Fetten has approached the restoration with both scholarly rigour and personal passion. He has hired leading conservation architects and craftsmen. He has consulted with English Heritage and with academic historians. But he is not creating a museum. Apethorpe Palace is being restored as a home, a place where people will live, eat, sleep, entertain guests. Modern kitchens and bathrooms are being installed, discreetly integrated into the historic fabric. Heating and electrical systems are being added, essential for comfortable modern living, but designed to be reversible and non-damaging to historic elements. The restoration has revealed extraordinary discoveries. The secret passage between the King's bedchamber and the Duke of Buckingham's apartments mentioned earlier was found during this restoration work. Workers have also discovered fragments of original wall paintings, hidden beneath later layers of paint. They have found architectural details, carved stone and wood, that had been covered up in later centuries and are now being revealed. Each discovery adds to our understanding of Apethorpe's history and informs decisions about restoration. The restoration has also sparked controversy, as such projects inevitably do. Some purists argue that Apethorpe should have been restored entirely to its Jacobean state, removing all later additions. Baron von Fetten has taken a different approach, arguing that the house's 4th-century history of evolution is itself important and should be preserved. He is restoring different parts of the house to different periods, the staterooms to their Jacobean glory, other parts preserving their Georgian or Victorian character. This approach, while more historically complex, respects the full history of the building. Other critics have focused on the decision to make Apethorpe a private residence rather than a museum. Should a building of such national importance be lived in privately? Baron von Fetten's response is pragmatic. A lived-in house is a preserved house. Apethorpe's best chance for long-term survival is as someone's home, cared for and maintained because the owner loves it and lives in it. A museum, he argues, is a kind of mausoleum, the building preserved but dead. A home is alive. And besides, he is committed to opening the house to the public for 50 days a year, for 80 years, far more public access than most privately owned historic houses provide. What does the future hold for Apethorpe Palace? If Baron von Fetten succeeds, if the restoration is completed to the highest standards, if the house is maintained and cared for, then Apethorpe could have another 4 centuries of life ahead of it. It will stand as a testament to the Jacobean age, to the extraordinary relationship between James the Bus and George Villiers, to the Fane family who preserved it for 3 centuries, to the English heritage movement that saved it from destruction, and to one man's passion for historic buildings. But the broader story of Apethorpe is also a meditation on the nature of grandeur and the passage of time. When James the Thorough built his staterooms in 1622, he was creating something he believed would last forever, a monument to his kingship and his love. He could not have imagined that within 30 years his son would be executed and the monarchy abolished. He could not have imagined that his beloved Apethorpe would cease to be a royal residence, would pass to the Fanes and then to the Brasses, would become a school and then stand empty and ruined. He certainly could not have imagined that in the 21st century a French baron would be painstakingly restoring what he built. The story of Apethorpe teaches us something about the ephemerality of power and wealth. The Earls of Westmoreland, who owned Apethorpe for 3 centuries, who seemed like permanent fixtures of the English aristocracy, were eventually defeated by economics and taxation. They had to sell. Their family connection to the house was broken. Henry Brassey, who bought Apethorpe with his railroad fortune, thought his family would be there for generations. Instead, less than 50 years later, his descendants were moving out, unable to afford to maintain the place. Beweiler thought he was buying an asset that would appreciate. Instead, he lost everything in a compulsory purchase order. But the story also teaches us something more hopeful about cultural heritage. Apethorpe survived because enough people cared about it. Local historians who rang alarm bells when it was deteriorating, English heritage officers who fought for resources to save it, government officials who had the courage to use controversial compulsory purchase powers, conservation specialists who devoted years to stabilizing and documenting it, and finally Baron von Fetten, who fell in love with a ruin and committed his fortune and his life to restoring it. Today, if you visit Apethorpe Palace during one of the public opening days, you can walk through the same rooms where James Us walked. You can stand in the King's bedchamber, beneath the plasterwork ceiling decorated with royal arms, in front of the fireplace carved with hunting scenes. You can walk the length of the long gallery, reading Mary Westmoreland's verse carved above the fireplace. You can see the entrance portal surmounted by James' own statue, If you're very observant and the guides point it out, you can see the entrance to the secret passage that once connected the king's apartment to his favourites. And if you go outside, into the grounds, you can stand beneath the Lebanese cedar planted in 1614, 400 years ago. Its massive branches spread wide, its trunk thick with centuries of growth. Beneath this tree you are connected directly to James I. He saw this tree as a sapling. He may have ordered it planted. He certainly walked beneath it during his visits. This tree has outlasted kingdoms, outlasted dynasties, outlasted fashions in architecture and philosophy and politics. It stands as a mute witness to 4 centuries of English history, and it will likely stand for centuries more, long after all of us are gone, long after Baron von Fetten's restoration is history itself, long after the controversies of our age are forgotten. Apethorpe Palace stands today as one of the finest surviving examples of Jacobean architecture in England. Its staterooms, with their elaborate plasterwork ceilings and monumental carved fireplaces, are the most complete surviving set of original Jacobean state apartments in the country. Its 3-courtyard plan gives it a grandeur and complexity matched by few private houses. Its royal associations are unparalleled. No other private house can claim to have been so extensively used by both James I and Charles I, to have been the site where James met his greatest favourite, to have been partially financed by a king's personal funds. But beyond its architectural and historical significance, Apethorpe is important as a case study in how we preserve our heritage. It demonstrates that even buildings that seem hopelessly ruined can be saved if we commit the resources and the will. It shows that compulsory purchase, used carefully and appropriately, can be a tool for preservation. It proves that private ownership and public access can coexist. And it reminds us that heritage is not just about preserving old buildings, but about keeping them alive, finding uses for them, allowing them to continue to evolve. As we conclude this long journey through Apethorpe's history, from medieval manor to Tudor house to Jacobean palace to Georgian estate to Victorian monument to near ruin to current restoration, what can we say about this extraordinary place? Apethorpe is, in the end, about love. It was built and expanded by people who loved it. Walter Mildmay, who transformed a medieval manor into a Renaissance house worthy of entertaining the Queen. James I, who loved it enough to pay for its expansion with his own money, who created secret passages so he could meet his beloved in privacy. The Fane family, who preserved it for 3 centuries, through civil war and revolution and all the changes of English history. And now Baron von Fetten, who fell in love with a ruin and is giving his fortune and his life to restore it. Buildings are just stone and wood and plaster. They decay, they can be demolished, they can be rebuilt. What makes them matter is the human stories they contain, the lives that were lived in them, the love that was expressed in them. Apethorpe mattered to James I not because it was grand, though it was, but because it was where he could be with the man he loved. It mattered to the Earls of Westmoreland not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was home, the physical embodiment of their family's continuity. It matters now not because it is historically significant, though it is, but because people have chosen to care about it, to fight for it, to save it. 400 years from now, if Apethorpe still stands, if its staterooms still contain their carved fireplaces and plasterwork ceilings, if the Lebanese cedar still spreads its branches, it will be because we, in our generation, decided that it mattered. That is the ultimate lesson of Apethorpe Palace. Heritage is not something we inherit passively, but something we choose actively to preserve and pass on. Every generation must decide anew what is worth saving, what is worth fighting for, what we want our children's children to inherit from us. Apethorpe's survival into our age, and its prospects for survival into future ages, depend on these choices. May they be made wisely,